All right, next item, 6, utility rate study update. Michelle, are you presenting?
Mayor and Commissioners, we have Andy with Stantec that plans to present tonight. Janelle, is he able to?
He's on there.
He's on? Okay. Andy, you should be able to come on.
That's great. I'm here, and let me see if I can share my screen successfully as well. So is everyone able to see the presentation okay?
DMA needs to change the, there we go. Oh, nope, not that.
Give us a second.
Okay.
It's control, it's window. And it has to be. It's duplicate, oh.
Sometimes the PowerPoint format is tough, so I can also do it in just a PDF version. There's no animation, so if that works better, just let me know.
With the green arrow. There you go.
You can go ahead. I'll fix it once I-
Okay, great. Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. Andy Burnham with Stantec. With me today also is Lisa Griesover. We've had the opportunity to work with staff and Commissioner Zinker, as this is a portfolio, to look at performing an update to the utility cost of service and rate design that's been in place for a few years now. And so we wanted to give you a presentation today to present where we've come to in terms of analyzing the data, what we're seeing, and put some options out for consideration by the Commission to then, identify what direction we should take from this point going forward now that we've completed the bulk of the analytical exercises that were scoped. So today what I'd like to do is kind of break this down into 4 components, just talk about a quick update to the financial planner outlook that was largely led by your staff and Dimitri in particular, and then talk about how that information then was used as part of an update to the cost of service analysis based upon most current billing data and information for the different customer classes within the city. And then segue into the different rate design options that we've looked at, looking at different fixed charge options, as well as potential changes to the residential tier structure, as well as modifications to the winter average basis of billing of sewer charges for multifamily and commercial accounts. And then at the end, try to synthesize this down as best I can into some bill comparisons to help you give an understanding of where these different options will lead in terms of customer impacts. And I'll give you some statistics about different percentages of customers at each of those different levels. So starting with the financial plan updates, what we've seen has been positive financial performance in the enterprise funds since the last study. And so as such, when we look at the adequacy of the revenues being provided by the current rates, we found them sufficient to meet your cost requirements in 23. So that means no rate increases have been identified for 2023 for water, for sewer, or for stormwater. And as we look at the outlook for each of those respective services, they remain very positive. With the water system, we're showing a forecast of potential 4% increases in the future. However, there are variables there associated with potential grant funding for our notable water treatment plant expansion. And obviously there's potential volatility in revenues associated with changes in sales and rainfall implications, but those things are intended to be monitored each year with the financial tools that your finance team has at their disposal, and working with Michelle. These will be things that'll be updated each year as part of the budget process, and the actual level of any future rate increases will be evaluated coincident with that budget process. Similarly, for the sewer system, as I mentioned, no rate increase is identified as being needed for fiscal year 2023. So it allows us to focus on evaluating these rate structure changes that I just mentioned a moment ago. The outlook is also very positive for the sewer system. We're presently showing a forecast of 2.25% increases in future years. But again, these will be things that will be updated as part of the budget process and brought back to you as part of making informed decisions about budgets and decisions relative to rates. And for the stormwater system, we have a very positive outlook, adequate cash flow provided by the current rates, so no increases for 23. And at present, we don't see any on the horizon. However, we'll have to just keep in mind future investment requirements that may be asked of the enterprise fund to make sure we have adequate resources for those. But given what we see today, the outlook for stormwater is also very positive. and seems to allow for adequate investment in capital that may be required from the enterprise fund in the future. So with that in mind, we then focused on updating the cost of service allocations. It's been a few years since the original rate study was conducted. And so we wanted to take into account current billing statistics, data from the advanced metering infrastructure system we have about current customer usage profiles, and then look at, making some adjustments to incorporate that data. So when we looked at the water system, we did look at consolidating irrigation meters for those accounts that may have them back into the normal billing that would apply to the primary meter for the account, meaning no more separate irrigation rates. And if it's a commercial account with 2 meters, that second meter for irrigation would just be billed at the commercial rate, as an example. As we did the update for cost of service, we did see some changes in the customer behavior since the rates have been adjusted. We did see some reductions in residential peaking factors, and particularly max hour demands, which you'll see in some of the bar charts here has resulted in a lower cost allocation to residential customer classes. And conversely, we have seen with one of our consecutive users, South Central, they have increased their water use and their peaking characteristics, and you'll notice an increase in the cost requirement versus the current rates that are in place today. And as it relates to the sewer side, the use of the winter average billing for all accounts, particularly for the multifamily and commercial, does have an impact on the amount of billable gallons and changes the unit rate. And so we'll go over customer impacts of that in terms of accounts that maybe had already been billed on the winter average, or those that do have a lower winter use, what the impacts of this mean to them as part of this conversation today. So keeping this a big picture, when we look at really our current year revenue requirements for 22, based on the cost of service approach, consistent with the prior rate study and the updated billing statistics, the orange bar, the bar on the left-hand side, shows by different customer classification what the current cost of service is based upon that most recent billing data and usage patterns of the different customer groups. And that's compared to the gray bar, the bar on the right-hand side, that shows the current revenue. So if you look at single family, you can see the current revenue from the existing rates is about 11.4 million, but the cost of service based upon the most recent customer usage information is about 10.5 million. So that means that we should really calibrate to that and look at restructuring the rates to reflect that lower cost of service requirements for single family customers. And since the total is the same, it's 19.4 million of overall rate revenues that we're looking at. That means that certain other customer groups will see some increases based upon changes in their billing statistics. I mentioned South Central sees a greater allocation because of their changes. Similarly, non-residential and multifamily also see slight increases in their cost allocations based upon the updated information. When we look at the wastewater side or the sewer side, again, factoring in the winter average reduces the billable units for, in particular, multifamily and non-residential classes, which affects the cost allocations. So while it's a sum of 14.4 million in our cost of service and current revenues, the distribution is affected by the change in those billable units for sewer service. So when you snap these two things together, because most customers have both water and sewer service, you can see that generally the results of the cost of service analysis are very much in keeping with current revenues. We do have a slight reduction for single family, a slight increase for multifamily, a slight reduction for non-residential, and a slight increase for South Central. So overall, we're factoring in the specific changes in customer usage characteristics in billable units as part of this conversation. But as compared to the prior study, these changes are certainly modest in comparison. So as we move into rate design, this is where we've developed several different options in consultation with staff based upon the direction from the scoping process for this update. And so we've looked at a few different options for fixed cost, those monthly service charges. And we've developed 3 options, the first of which is updating the approach used in the 2019 study that had a fixed charge component that captured customer cost and part of our readiness to serve cost for meeting average day demands. And then we looked at 2 alternative approaches, option B, which instead of recovering some of those readiness to serve costs in the fixed charges or the monthly service charges, we included a portion of the peaking cost of the system, both max day as well as max hour cost requirements. And then a third option was to, instead of looking at it in those terms, really look at having kind of a customer component as well as an infrastructure fee that initially would start out capturing our current debt service expenses or our principal and interest payments for capital investment. So it kind of moves away from tying to different demand characteristics and costs for meeting those and ties it to a type of cost instead. And then on the water usage rates, we did look at for single family updating the current 5-tier structure and keeping all customer classes on the same unit rate calculation, just reflecting the current cost of service. But then we looked at a 4-tier rate structure for single family. We looked at a uniform rate for each individual customer class. So that means no tiers. What does that look like? And then we also looked at a uniform rate across the entire system. So meaning regardless of the cost of service for each customer class, we're looking at it on a system-wide basis and saying, what's our overall unit cost? And going to kind of a single retail rate for the entire service area or the city. And then for sewer, we looked at the winter average billing, all classes. And so what happens when we start looking at these alternatives, as you can imagine, is we're going to start having several different combinations that are going to be arguably one of the more challenging things I've had to present because of the variety of the combinations that we have here, but I'm going to give it a shot. So when we look at the fixed costs for the water system, and the current column on the left shows by meter size what the current monthly service charges are and how much revenue that generates on an annual basis, and what percentage of the total water revenue requirements are generated from those fixed charges. Using a similar methodology as was done in the 2019 study is column option A. And so that generates about $5.24 million and a very similar percentage of the overall revenue requirement. In option B, where we shift the types of costs we include in the fixed charge to be peaking related costs, you can see that the fees increase, and we're looking at a revenue of about 5.9 million, or about 30.5% of our total revenue requirement. This is certainly a positive from a revenue stability impact, but as we get into customer impacts, you'll see that there may be concerns about impacts to lower volume users where this fixed charge represents a larger portion of their bill. And then in option C, that was a customer cost as well as recovering our debt service for capital improvements or that infrastructure type fee, as I'd mentioned. And this would be a slightly lower level of revenue at 4.8 million, or about 24%. So this kind of runs in the opposite direction as option B in terms of fiscal stability, as well as customer impacts for lower volume uses. On the sewer rates, since we don't necessarily have peaking cost requirements, we really looked at updating the cost of service based upon the current information. And so you can see there the updated cost of service generates about $4.1 million of revenue and 21.5%. So really no changes to the rate structure there. But if we went to an infrastructure fee for the sewer system, similar to the approach for the water system, you could see that would slightly reduce the level of the meter size, fixed charges by meter size. And we get about $3.85 million, or about 20%. So it's a pretty comparable option on the sewer side to what we have in place today. So as we think about these fixed cost recovery options, I've again kind of summarized each of these options A, B, and C at the top. And you'll see throughout the slide deck, for those that want to look at it later and spend more time looking at the options, try to include these descriptions throughout to help everybody keep them top of mind to know what they're looking at, because the options are maybe more than just one or two. We've tried to assess each of these options relative to one another in a matrix format. So looking at the left-hand column, we've identified certain attributes of rates or objectives that are important to consider, whether it's affordability, revenue stability, administrative ease or burden, consistency with industry practice, transparency. And we've tried to score each of these options relative to one another in terms of which one has the best impacts from a customer affordability perspective, which is the least effective, and what's kind of in the middle. And so the yellow indicates it's neutral. It's kind of in the middle. The red X indicates it's maybe the least effective alternative for that particular criteria. And the green check mark means that of the three options, it really represents the best alternative for that particular criteria. So you can see for option A, it's pretty neutral. It's kind of the middle option on affordability, revenue stability, and transparency. And it gets pretty high marks on administrative ease and consistency with industry practice. Option B scores highest in revenue stability, administrative ease, consistency with industry practice, but because it generates a greater level of fixed cost recovery and results in higher fixed fees, it's probably the least effective in addressing customer affordability concerns for lower volume users. And it's kind of middle of the road in transparency. It's pretty consistent with option A. And then option C has high marks for affordability. It results in the least or the lowest fixed charges. But conversely, then that means it's going to have a lower kind of relative ranking on revenue stability. Administrative ease, you're really, again, getting high marks for all three options. It's not necessarily a very common industry practice to have separate infrastructure fees. but it's not necessarily unheard of either. So it gets kind of a neutral score there. And then on transparency, though, we do think, having kind of those infrastructure costs called out separately does add a bit of transparency to the rate making process, more so than options A and B. So hopefully this matrix is kind of helpful for you as well as the public to kind of consider the attributes of these different options on the fixed cost. And we have a similar one for the variable rates. That's the other part of the bill. And so as we get into looking at the tiered rates in particular for single family customers, the current structure is a 5-tier system. And for 0 to 4 units, it's billed at the lowest rate, and the rate gradually increases based upon cost for each of the other defined tiers. And so as part of this analysis, we looked at the current distribution of bills for 2021. And what you see at the bottom of this slide is a table that goes horizontally showing by month in that calendar year what was the median, or where 50% of our bills were each month. So in January, half of our bills were issued for 5 units. In February, again, going along the top row, 4 units, and you can see throughout the year. And so on average for that median bill throughout the year, there were 8 units of water used. And that's highlighted in red in the bottom table, third column from the right. And then we also looked at other percentiles. And we looked at the 80th percentile and saw that average use was about 15. We looked at the 95th and saw it was about 24. We also looked at that median and said, in that summer months, generally we're keeping irrigation around those 16 units. And so we looked at developing an alternative system based on some of these statistical points that said, let's look at a 4-tier system that expands the first tier to really be from 0 to 8 units. That's the second tier to be for 9 to 16, which would capture that summer irrigation for the median and the average use at the 80th percentile. And then looking at from that 16 or above point to 24 units, which takes us to the 95th percentile of bills issued, their average use, and then everything above that. And so we use that information as an alternative approach for looking at a new tier structure for single family as part of the study update. And so the variable rates for each of the options that we've developed really depend on what we do with those fixed cost options. And so this is where we start getting into some combinations. And so we've included in this presentation 3 similar charts that show what the variable rates would be as they sit today currently, which is the leftmost column. Then what the updated results are under the current system of 5 tiers and uniform rates for multifamily residential and non-residential, what the 4-tier rate structure would look like in terms of those rates, and then how the unit rates would be if we had one for each class and no tiered system for single family, and what a system-wide unit rate would be. And so for each of these options, you can see how the rates will change depending upon the decisions that are also made with the fixed cost options. As I mentioned, this becomes a bit of a matrix conversation. And so you can see for the updated cost of service, the tiers 1 through 5 as compared to the current structure, the rates are all lower. As I mentioned, the water cost of service is a little bit less than the current revenues in place today. So all these rates come down a little bit in the status quo scenario. And then based upon a different tier system, you can see tier 1 and tier 2 are kind of consolidated in the 4-tier option. And then tier 3 kind of becomes tier 2. Tier 4, sort of becomes tier 3 in the 4-tier system. And then tier 5 sort of becomes the rate for the 4th tier, is effectively the way the math works. We also have identified at the bottom of the table, as I mentioned, for each of these options, the multifamily rates, what the current rate is, what the updated rate is for the cost of service, and the same approach today, and then what it would be for the uniform system-wide rate. And those last 2 columns, you can see that when we have a unit rate for each class, it's based upon the cost to serve each class. So you can see the rates are different, but if we have a system-wide retail rate structure, you can see that unit rate would be the same for everyone at $3.21 with option A. And I'm not going to go through the same level of detail for each of these other 2 slides, but just to show you that they exist. So you can look at option A versus the rates for option B. And because we have more revenue recovery in the fixed fee in option B, you can see the unit rate at the far right goes down as compared to option A. And then in option C, since it has less revenue in the fixed fee, you can see the usage rate is higher in that unit rate column. And so hopefully having these slides organized this way gives you a way to evaluate the rates. But I think the most important way is really understanding how these combinations affect utility bills. And that's where we'll be going here in just a moment. So when we look at a similar evaluation of the variable rate options that were developed, again, looking at some 4 common criteria or attributes of the rate structure: affordability, proportional equity, administrative ease, consistency with industry practice. You can see the alternatives, generally are scoring pretty well. The thing I'll note about alternative 4 is it would be a bit of a departure from the current rate structure, where you have the data and the information and have done the analysis to separate costs between customer classifications. So as you think about going to a potential system-wide rate, there may be some challenges there or some potential risk just from a proportional equity standpoint, given what we know about customer characteristics. And similarly, anytime we introduce a system-wide unit rate, when we have a tier system in place for single family in particular, that means that the low volume users will be pretty impacted, because now they'll be going to a uniform rate that's much higher than that initial tier rate. So just keep that in mind as we think about those 2 uniform rate options. And then for the sewer rates, again, we really have just updated the unit rates for each customer class based upon the winter average billing, the adjusted billed volumes, and the cost of service. And depending upon whether we keep with the current approach on the fixed charge or have an infrastructure fee, you can see the different level of rates there, and the usage rates would be higher in the infrastructure fee scenario because we're recovering less in our fixed charges. So what we've done is develop bill comparisons. And this next slide is a bit of a glossary and index to come back and refer to that shows you how things are organized. I'm not intending to go through this by any means today, because I think I can better explain it with an actual example, which this is intended to be an index for. So this chart here represents a combined bill comparison for residential customers with a 3/4 inch meter. This represents about 48%, just a little bit under based upon the current billing data. And what this does is it shows on the left-hand side just what's the monthly usage amount and the annual percentile of bills issued for that amount or less. So by row, we have 3 CCF. That's where the first 25% of your bills are issued for that amount or less. Then we looked at the median, or 50%, and that's from 8 CCF down. Then we looked at up to 15 CCF, which 80% of the bills are issued for that amount or less. 19 CCF, which is at that 90th percentile. So we've issued 90% of our single family bills for that amount or less. And then lastly at 23 CCF, which is at that 95th percentile. And we've identified on the current bill, what is that rate today? So you can see for each of those different usage levels, the monthly bill in the 2022 current rates column. You can see it's $35 ranging down to $157. And then what we did is we developed what the updated bills would be based upon those rates under each of the different alternatives. So for alternative 1, with the same 5-tier system, alternative 2 for the 4-tier system, alternative 3 with a uniform rate for the single family class based upon their cost of service, and alternative 4, which is a system-wide unit rate. And then underneath those headers, we then said, well, if you had the fixed charge under option A, B, or C, what would the bill be in that scenario of usage rates? And we highlighted bills that go up with a red background or shading. So anything that has a red backdrop to it, for instance, the entire row of 3 CCF, you can see the background formatting is red, meaning those bills go up as it relates to what's in place today. And anything in green represents a bill that's lower than what's in place today. And so you can see for alternative 1, the updated cost of service and same tiers, there's a slight increase. If we look at option A or option C, the bill goes up by about $1 in either of those options, but under option B, it would go up by about $5. And so this is a way that we thought it would be effective to generally be able to absorb the range of potential customer impacts from each of these different options that we've developed and looked at in consultation with staff. And so as you look at this chart, the more green you see, this is where you would see more bills going down. The more red you see in that option, you see more bills going up. And so in looking at this chart for 3/4 inch meter, alternative 2, certainly has the least amount of red in it. But if you look at it compared to alternative 1, you can actually see the rate of increase for those very low volume bills of 3 CCF. They're actually a little bit lower. So it's not only also looking at the kind of the amount of red, but also taking a minute to look at the dollar differences as well, because that way you can really appreciate the significance of the impacts. as opposed to just knowing the direction. We also did the same chart for 1-inch meters, which represents also about 48% of your customers. I think one's just over 48%, one's just under. So this is the vast majority of residential customers, and organized it much the same way. So you can again see what the bills would be for each of these different options on the usage rates or the variable rates in tandem with the different fixed charge options. And so you can again see the bills that go up and go down and visually see the dollar change. For the 1-inch meters, if you look at the option C approach, you can definitely see that there are some notable changes there in terms of increases for the 3 CCF as compared to say option A for both of those options. We did the same thing for multifamily, but it's a little bit more simple for those because we really just had 2 alternatives of the usage rates to look at. The updated unit rate for the cost of service and then a system-wide rate. And what we found here is that really with the benefit of winter averaging on the wastewater side, really those that have a lower winter use will generally see a reduction in their bill. So if you look at the first example, if they use 6 units or CCF year round, depending upon the option, there might be a modest increase consistent with the cost of service. But if they have a lower winter volume, you can see that the bills are actually going down to varying degrees depending upon the options that we look at because of the use of the winter averaging for billing. And we see that same dynamic for non-residential customers to a degree, depending upon the amount of winter use that they have. So this is an example of some 1-inch meter accounts that have different usage combinations. And again, consistent with the cost of service results, you can see some slight increases to those that have year-round consistent water use, but those that have lower winter usage, they may see some reductions in their bill depending upon how much lower that is versus the summer usage. And so with that, I know that's an incredible amount of information to digest, but as a working group, we thought it was important to bring all the options to the table to then see the direction from the commission in terms of where we proceed from here in terms of public engagement or looking at these options and potentially narrowing them down. So at this point, I'm really happy to open up the conversation and help you, really understand everything I put out there that's incredibly detailed, I know.
Commissioner Zinker.
I'll tee it up for you guys, and then whoever wants to chime in with some questions. So when we went through this, and we've hashed this out for a while now. I don't want this to come down to, hey, that the idea is to change. We got to change with a plan. My thought is as we drove around, and I've said many times at this table, as I drive around the city in the last 2 summers and notice how dry our city is, one, because of the drought, and 2 is maybe the thought process is the cost of what it takes to water and watch kids play in their toddler pool and those types of things. I want to be able to bring that concept back so people aren't scared to run their water in the summertime and enjoy it. 2, I wanted to add the level of transparency because we talk about how much it costs for us to fund infrastructure and the types of monies that we're talking about, because it doesn't take long in this side of the business to get to 15, 16, 18, $100 million, right? And I thought if it's tied into the rate, it's really tough to see that. So when you look at all the option C stuff that's in our presentation, a lot of that is driven by me because I wanted to see what our infrastructure cost was for both treatment plants, and then so residents can see what our cost to serve is from a water distribution or treatment side of things from water and sewer. So we're not going to finalize any decisions tonight, obviously. There are 2 things I think that's important to understand that staff right now is currently working on 2 informational meetings. We don't have those dates set yet for the month of January because I've given them a deadline for February 1st to have that done so we can come back in the first week in February or second week in February and get more information from the general public. I actually did ask for a amendment to the agenda so we could speak after, but Mother Nature doesn't allow us to pull off all the stuff that we wanted to talk about, so the room's not as full unless there's some people on Zoom that I
There
don't.
are.
There are? Oh, fantastic. So we'll be able to open that up to the general public, but right now, for me, from a perspective, I've said from day one, I don't like the 5-tier scenario. And if you look at the graph, it looks like it's okay just because that's what our current system's built around. But I'm really curious as to what our general public has to say about the rest of it, and then whatever questions from the rest of the commissioners are. So with that, I'll turn it over to whoever.
Okay, Commissioner Markort.
Mayor, Commissioners, Commissioner Zenker, so going through the process, I went on the first go-around, and you went about it on the second. Is there an option that you like to see better, seeing all the numbers and going through all the data with staff and Stantec on where we're at, with our water treatment and also wastewater?
So yeah, with that, for my perspective, and it's me, right? I like the option C because it splits out the infrastructure costs and the cost to serve, so we know what we have. But the other thing it also does is there's a give and take. There is a little bit of revenue stability. I'm not too worried about that because it's only about $500,000 difference.
Well, that
there.
was my question that I would have is from the revenue stability when you're looking at that infrastructure piece, how volatile is that and what would
Well-
the impact potentially be year to year?
So here's the volatility of that, how I see it. How I see that volatility is, hey, right now, Mr. Ritter came up and we're talking to the chamber, we're talking local legislation. There's some dire funds that we need for both of our treatment plants. If we don't get those dire funds, the only way for us to do that is to finance those projects and then show that from a transparency standpoint as to what that new rate is going to be.
I like the transparency piece. I just want to know.
Right.
So we
And-
can
and
make
that
sure the
will-
public understands what that
Right,
volatility
and
might
that's,
be.
and that's exactly what that fee would be, is the finance part of our infrastructure or infrastructure fee. Some of it, we're not gonna have to finance it, but when we're talking the amount of money that we're talking about right now, if we don't get grant funding, the only way to do it is to finance it.
Right.
Because we're not gonna be able to build that cash long enough to take care of some of the items that we need. One, we just need to make some updates, and two, from a federal guideline, because you never know when the EPA is gonna change the rules and regulations, right? And you gotta be nimble, and unfortunately, that nimbility costs you a lot of money, right? So that's kinda where I'm leaning. It kinda gets rid of the rate structure, the tiers, basically, and gives you one rate all of the time. It doesn't matter how much water you use, it's the same dollar amount. I do have some leniency towards those people who only use 4 or 5 units, because that will basically double their water price. So instead of $1.51 or whatever it is today, $1.80, it'll go to $3.05 or $3.06 or $3.44, depending on where that falls in line. So I do have some little bit of heartache with that. From people who have bigger families, I think it'll help balance their monthly budgets a little bit, because for your summer and your winter, it'll be a little bit closer than a large spike than what you could have average, $60, $80, $90 in December, January, February, and then it's all of a sudden it's $130, $140 in those summer months. So I the nice thing when you have the meetings inside, you can kind of analyze some of those things and see what you can do. That's why it's really, really critical and important that we get as much information from the public as possible.
Commissioner?
Mayor and Commissioners, and I don't have an issue with that, and I look forward to seeing what kind of comments and stuff we get back from the citizens, and when we have some of that public input, from going from where we were at prior to setting up something, gathering that information, and then adjusting. That was one of the biggest things that we needed to do as far as the city, as far as where we're at, what those water needed to be, and then to be able to have this time to be able to adjust and see where we're at moving forward, and making sure that we are transparent with that and what those costs actually are, because we didn't have that before.
Oh, and I could absolutely, and I'll admit this too. Tonight is, when we talked about going back into this rate study and spending that money, I was extremely critical of doing that. And, honestly, it's probably a vote that I was glad I lost, because we have so much data information that we can get from our water side and what Stantec was able to pull together. When you can break down everything that you have and you know exactly where your cost to serve is and goes, whether it's multifamily, commercial, or residential, or, irrigation, or whatever we could ask for, they could answer. Then it comes to us to make those tough decisions as to how we want to bill for that service. So, yeah, we can't go back to 2018 because it was completely broken then, and I agree with that. But I think we can make some modifications to make it better.
Commissioner Sponskowski, do you have a question?
Yes, I just kind of want to reiterate what Commissioner Zenker said, and let you guys know that I very much agree with his mindset. I like that option C. I tend to like that single rate system as far as charging. However, I definitely look forward to seeing more details and seeing more, or I should say, really looking at the numbers and more meetings about how really to hash this out. And just really wanted to reiterate what Commissioner Zenker said and concur with his thoughts as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Cleary, did you have any comments?
I just wanted to thank Andy too for all this information. I think the citizens being able to see these numbers too is going to help immensely. Definitely see some pros with option C. I think the transparency playing a part with the infrastructure would be good. But I guess I can see some pros too with some of the other options, especially when we're talking about those low usage rates. But I think it'll just be good for us to hear from the public and just kind of see where everybody's at and kind of absorb all this information because it's definitely a lot.
All right, thank you. Do we have some individuals online who wish to?
Mr. Frank, I believe.
Okay.
You want to let him know?
Mr. Frank, if you can speak to this topic, we're here to listen.
He's still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My name's, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you might need to speak up a little bit.
A little bit louder?
Yes.
My name's Al Frank. I had an attachment that I sent to Jason today. And there was two things that concerned me. I followed this process from the beginning. Two things. One is what class uses the most water? And secondly is a tier structure. And I was lucky enough, I might say, to get the 216 data from Public Works and confirm that on an annual basis, the residents only use 43% of the water processed, where all others use 57%. That's 216 data. With the droughts we've had and with the cost, I'm sure those numbers for the residents have gone down. You only have to drive around town to realize the residents are not using 43% of the water on an annual basis. Now the city and Public Works always come around and say, well, we have to look at the peak months, and they use May through September, through August, I think, or September. When you do that, the residents use 51% and all others use 49%. And I would challenge you that difference is not significant. because of the great variability in those types of measurements and the climate associated with using the water. But what it amounts up to is that your biggest water user is not the residents of Bismarck. There's over 17,000 in the 216 study. You only use 43% of the water on an annual basis. About 4,000 other users use 57% of the water. Those are big numbers. Those are big numbers. Now, when you tie that into the tier system, what you're saying is the people that use the least amount of water, or at least an equal amount of water during the high peak months, are paying a much higher rate than the ones that don't. You can have a twin home and a single family home side by side. The twin home has a major advantage in the cost of the water they're using compared to the residential. That is just not fair. Just not fair. You talk peak a lot. On the peak, I would like to see the numbers for average for the number of users. It's confounded data. You have 17,000 users, you're comparing that to 4,000 users. That's confounding. That's not acceptable from a statistical standpoint. So I would like to see something done to make it more equal. I really don't care if you change the rates or cost, total cost. You just got to be fair to the people. They got to feel fair. I go down Tyler and the Burnt Boat Road area in the summertime in the morning. Those sprinklers are running all the time. And I can't run my sprinklers. I can't afford it. Those are running all the time because they have a lower rate. They don't have to worry about it. They turn them on in the spring, let them run, turn them off in the fall. The Convention and Visitors Bureau does the same thing down there at the corner of Tyler and Burnt Boat. So those things need to be looked at. So the residents are probably paying too much as a class for the water they're using. If you corrected and at least made all other users pay similarly, you can have a big increase in revenue, a large increase in revenue, because you have a lot of water being used there. You have a lot of water being used. So just currently, many users are not paying their fair share. I think that's one of my messages. And that was one of the things the commission, though Public Works, emphasized at the beginning of 2019. We don't want to punish you for using a lot of water. We just want you to pay your fair share. The current system doesn't do that. Thank you for your comments. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. On my note that I send in, I put my name and email address on there. I'd be willing to visit with anybody on this. I've done a lot of work with water research standpoint in my career. I've done a lot of work with statistical analysis, and I don't think I'm off the base at all. So thanks again.
Thank you for your comments. Do we have anyone else? Do we have anyone in the audience who wishes to speak on this topic? Okay. It's not a, go ahead, Commissioner.
So Mayor, Commissioners, just to reemphasize, Michelle and her team, and we're working with Kaylin, we'll get those public PSAs out, and then we'll look forward to gathering more information at those attended meetings.
Yeah. And we would like to encourage people to participate. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.